All right, you guys, we're almost done with our discussion on acute inflammation. Let's get going. So in our previous video, we finished all of the checked off items here. And in this video, we'll focus especially on the different types of acute inflammation and what the possible outcomes can be for acute inflammation, anywhere from the tissue heals, we're back to the way we were, or the extreme end, meaning that the inflammation turns into chronic inflammation. There are four types of acute inflammation: serous, fibrinous, purulent, and ulcerative. We'll take a closer look at each one of them. Serous inflammation, remember, we'll think of the word or think of serous fluid. It's a watery fluid, or even serous glands. They secrete a rather watery fluid. And so therefore, it might be easy for you to remember that a good example of a form of serous acute inflammation is a blister, as is shown here, right? That looks like somebody burnt themselves. This is as a result of inflammation, acute inflammation, which, as you know by now, means vasodilation with leaky capillaries. But in this form of inflammation, acute inflammation, we have a pretty low capillary wall permeability. So not lots of leakage, which means that maybe just a few tiny proteins might sneak out. And because the exudate is pretty not very rich in big proteins, it can be absorbed by the lymphatic capillaries. And so therefore, this is the kind of inflammation that disappears pretty relatively quickly. Of course, none of us like to have a blister because it does take a while for it to go away, but it doesn't go on and on and on. So here we get to a fibrinous inflammation. You know by now what fibrin does. It helps clot, right, our blood. It helps create a network of strands that can trap not just blood cells, but pathogens. So this is going to be consisting of an exudate that is made up of much larger proteins. Fibrin is a much larger protein, obviously. This is a process that has greater capillary wall permeability than the one that we just discussed, called serous inflammation. And a good example is an inflammation of the serous membranes of the heart, called the visceral and the parietal pericardium. And when they become inflamed, we call that pericarditis. And so it's typically going to be fibrinous pericarditis. So this brings us to our third type of acute inflammation, called purulent inflammation, and its characteristic is pus. You may also have noticed that as we go through these forms of acute inflammation, our level of capillary permeability has increased. So we're now at a very high level of capillary permeability, to where our exudate, which is a form of pus, actually contains whole cells and parts of cells in addition to protein. So it's a much thicker type of exudate, as you can see here in this form of conjunctivitis, or here in tonsillitis. We may also see this when the pancreas is inflamed. Often the bacterium that is at fault here, like in conjunctivitis or in this tonsillitis, is S. aureus or Staphylococcus aureus. Finally, we get to our last form of acute inflammation, called ulcerative inflammation. Literally, we form an erosion, which we call an ulcer in the wall of, let's say, an organ. This is due to the fact that the inflammation has created a form of necrosis. So cells are dying by means of necrosis and literally slough off, creating a bit of a crater. And this can then be replaced, that crater area, with scar tissue. Of course, that's usually not such a great thing in the body organs such as our our skin or our mucous membranes because now there's an area that doesn't function as well. Okay, so we finally now get to the possible outcomes of acute inflammation. And we're going to go from great, everything has been resolved, we're back to where we were before inflammation, to, oh no, we can't get rid of the inflammation and it becomes a chronic form of inflammation. So when everything heals without any kind of tissue damage, that's called resolution. On the other hand, when scar tissue is formed because fibroblasts are going to deposit collagen fibers into the tissue that is damaged or the tissue area that is damaged, then we refer to this type of outcome as fibrosis. Literally, we're creating a fibrous tissue with the help of these collagen fibers. And this sometimes happens in, well, not sometimes, this tends to happen when a person has had a heart attack, a myocardial infarction. The muscle cells die because they became ischemic, and instead of their heart muscle cells can't divide and replace themselves. So instead, scar tissue fills in that particular area. As you can imagine, the heart is not going to be able to do its contracting and all of its um, stretching in response to the blood filling the heart as well with all of those collagen fibers present. So the heart really loses his efficiency with all of that scar tissue. If we don't see scar tissue form, we might form an abscess, which we that doesn't feel so great. So we're now creating this cavity that's filled with pus, and it's very reddish around the actual abscess. It's painful. We see it often happening in the skin and or around our teeth, right? And so this is not pleasant. It's painful, and often antibiotics can't treat an abscess, and an abscess may need to be drained so it'll heal much better and faster. So we're done with acute inflammation, which means we're ready to discuss chronic inflammation. And we've already discussed the subacute inflammatory transition period, so we're not going to come back to that.